Hello. The Citadel Design Studio has produced some of the most iconic miniatures ever, from Space Marines in 40k to Orcs in HeroQuest and everything in between. My guest today is Bob Naismith, the sculptor who created that very first Space Marine before Warhammer 40,000 even existed. We talk about his career before he joined Citadel Miniatures, when he was creating historical miniatures, when he joined Citadel and the people he worked with, the projects he was involved with, and how he led the studio team over the years. We explore some of the incredible collaborations between Citadel and MB Games in HeroQuest and Space Crusade, and how he helped Brian Ansell introduce the world to Warhammer plastics. Bob Naismith has had an amazing career in miniature creation, sculpting, and design, and we talk about a huge amount of it. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I have the great privilege of being in conversation with sculptor Bob Naismith. Bob, thank you so much for joining me. I like to start these conversations just by getting a bit of your history. So how did you come to sculpting miniatures and being interested in them?
Okay, so as a teenager, got into wargaming, mainly historical wargaming, and on the back of like building old Airfix stuff, kits, trying unsuccessfully to get paint to stick onto Airfix historicals, like most people did. There was at that time I lived in Glasgow or outside Glasgow, and there was a model shop there, right in the middle of the city called Argyle Models, under the main railway bridge, and it had just beautiful models, there that had been built by local people and painted stuff, and there were someone was painting the 1/32 Airfix stuff, and they were doing such a fantastic job. I thought, I'd love to do that. So we were, like everyone else, we were looking at military modelling and Airfix, because they were really the only magazines that were around, and picked up that there was a little shop that had started in, again, in the centre of Glasgow, in a garret, called War Games Publications Scotland Limited. And there's a wee story there, because they Steve and Ian Livingston and Steve Jackson, they got the license for D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. And I was listening to an interview where he said they did it on the hoof and on the fly, and actually they only ordered 6 copies, according to Ian. But on the strength of that, they got the European contract for Dungeons and Dragons, which I thought was just amazing. Now, the people at War Games Publications had also been speaking to Gary Gygax about getting that, but Ian and Steve beat them to the post, so they got the deal, and War Games Publications didn't, and they've been out of existence now for quite some time. But that's where I went in, first met proper fantasy models, first met loads of people who were interested in that sort of thing. Initially, they wanted people to paint models, and that's what I did. Painted War Games figures for them. There was another outfit in Yorkshire called Newbury Design, or New Hope Design.
Right.
And they did 54mm historical for the most part, and I painted figures for them for a couple of years as a student. And then the guys at War Games Publications decided they wanted to get into manufacturing, and they showed me some of the masters that they'd had other people make, and they looked fine, and they said, "Do you want to have a go?" And so I went off. At that point I was at art school, and I just got myself some milliput, because green stuff I was not aware of at that time, so I sculpted my first stuff in milliput, and made samurai for them, and they were really pleased with that stuff. That was great, and just went on from strength to strength there.
Amazing. So just totally self-taught then. You weren't studying any kind of like sculpture or anything like that at
Well, yeah,
the art.
yeah, at art school, I went to quite I describe it as a Presbyterian Northern art school where you were
Right.
expected to learn how to draw properly and to understand, good color theory and the history of art,
Mm.
and all these things. So it was a very strong base for doing pretty much any art, really. But I did, what did I do? I did silversmithing, which of course was
Mm.
working at a jeweler's bench, and graphic design. So those were the two specialisms. But I love doing sculpture, always did. Um, and history of art, was great because it introduced you to all the classical influences that kind of fuel what a lot of our fantasy is about now. So yeah,
Yeah.
that was the preparation for it. Lots of figure drawing. We always did figure drawing. So yeah, that was the grounding for it. So I've always liked to try to be aware of proportions, pose, dynamism, dramatic effect, all of these sort of things. So rather than just having a man standing there kind of picking his nose, it's you want someone who's demonstrating an act or an emotion or a feeling
Mm.
or something, so that when people look at the figure, they don't just see what he's wearing. They think, oh, he's angry, or he's scared, or he's excited
Yeah.
in some way. So yeah, that was it, and yeah, it was great. And because at that time, as a sculptor, you were left pretty much to your own devices about what you wanted to make and how you wanted to make it. The only
Right.
only problem was that because you were making war games figures, they had to rank up. So you had to make sure that you didn't make figures that were just had crazy poses that wouldn't allow you to build a 10 or 20 man unit. That was the only restriction, really. But apart from that, it
Right.
was up to me.
That's great. Yeah, so you started with samurai. Did you sort of stay around that kind of like ancient
What?
Japanese, medieval Japanese sort of space,
No,
or
no, because samurai was their wish. So we did samurai, and then we I think we went on to we did more like Middle East, like Assyrians, Sassanids, Abbasids, all those sort of things from the Middle East. We did those. Then we did we did loads. We did Italian wars. We did the colonial period. We did Zulus. We did South American tribes like the Maya and the Inca. We did Renaissance. We did Napoleonic. We did them in 25 mil. We did them in 15 mil. Yeah, we made loads of stuff, and
right?
I think it's still around actually. In fact, I had a couple of emails from people who still want to get their hands on original Naismith design models. And
Right.
I'm nothing to do with Naismith design now. But I think they're still being sold by an outfit called Noble Knight.
Right.
Whether they're here, whether they're in the States, I have no idea. But
Sure.
they still have got access to some of them with the original blister cards on.
Right. Wow. What? And they're like as in the literally original ones cast
Yeah, as
way
far
back.
as I can see,
Incredible.
I mean,
Yeah,
whether
that's
they're
great.
new castings or not, I have no idea. I mean, they'd have to have remade the molds, I'm sure, because
Right.
you're going back 30 years, 35 years, I guess. And I don't know how long a rubber mold lasts.
Sure.
You'd have to ask some of the, like, people like Epp and he'd know.
Right. Sure. Yeah. 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 I mean, yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, because then Naismith Designs, this was the sort of the label that you were created at the time, right?
Yes,
Right.
yes. I mean, we did it. Initially, I've been making figures for War Games publications, and then I got married, and I needed to have a house, and because of that, I needed to have an income. So myself and the two other guys involved in Naismith Design, Jim and Neil, we formed a company in partnership with Navwar, who were an outfit down in London. And they made 1 1200th and 1 3000th naval wargaming ships. And I made
Right.
loads of them as well for Navwar. and it was that setup which enabled me to buy a house in Edinburgh, and we stayed there for about 5 years, I guess,
Right.
something like that, before I moved down to Nottingham to join Brian and the crew.
Sure. Yeah. So how did that come about then? What was sort of led to the conversations with Brian Ansell?
Well, we did a load of figures for Naismith Design, and it was okay, but I was really the only. It's so common, I think, in enterprises to do with toy soldiers. I was really the only full-time person. Everyone else was doing it in a kind of part-time manner, and just throwing it in. Consequently, and I don't think they'd mind me saying this. I think to me, because it was my job, it mattered a lot. This was everything to me. Um, and for them, it was maybe, they always had their own job, their own circumstances to fall back on. So I felt that it wasn't working for me. And then I saw an advert I think it was military modelling, or it might have been Airfix. And it was an advert by Brian saying, we're looking for sculptors at Citadel. So I contacted him, and he said, "Come on down and we'll have a chat."
Mm.
So yeah, that was how it happened, and I ended up going to. I signed up with them probably about 6 months later, 9 months later.
Right. And
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
contingent on you moving down to Nottingham, or did you
No,
initially?
no, Brian was very good about that.
Right.
I mean, the decision for me to move down to Nottingham was largely our own. I say by that myself and my wife, we decided to move down because you could sense that Workshop was like a growing company,
Mm.
dynamic company. There was a lot going on. And yes, I could have stayed in Scotland and carry. I mean, we had a great life there. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I loved Edinburgh. I still do. But the idea of what else you could do if you were down here was the thing, and that's what drew us down. So yeah, we moved down of our own volition. But
Mm.
Brian was very good about that. He never pushed anyone to do anything like that I'm aware of.
Right. Great. So do you remember what the sort of, during that initial few months when you were working remotely,
Aye.
like what were you working on
Oh,
during that
all
time?
sorts of things because they at that time, oh gosh, Brian was like exploring everything.
Right.
So there was battle cars and there was Car Wars. Car Wars was the original Steve Jackson Games game, and while they weren't making, we didn't have our own battle cars game at that point, but we were making miniatures.
Mm.
So I was great because it was for me they were like making little models, battleships to make little vehicles, trucks, cars, all that kind of thing, and yeah, they were quite detailed. I remember
Mm.
we used to have to. I remember putting window trim on a little sports car, which was only, I don't know, about 15 mil long. So it was that kind of stuff. And I think I enjoyed that. Also did lots of masters, 3-up masters for weaponry for the Fighting Fantasy range. I don't know if you remember that, the 60 mil
Sure. Right.
plastics.
Yeah. So these were bigger, weren't they? They're the
Yeah,
actual
that's right. They
54.
were done on the back of Steve and Ian's Fighting Fantasy books,
Sure. Yeah.
I think. And I made some of those. I didn't make the figures because by that point most of the figures had been made either by the Perrys or by Nick Bibby.
Right.
So that was all done and dusted by the time I got there. So yeah,
So would
that's
you?
what I started with.
Right. And you'd literally just be like, okay, we need this guy to have an axe, and the sort of
Aye,
bodies
aye,
go on,
yeah,
and
yeah.
just right.
Brian would think about it more like codes. So he'd say, right, okay, I need I don't know, 20 Chaos Warriors.
Right.
So we would just go and make 20 Chaos Warriors. I'd just make 20 figures. And I think you'd have to say, if you looked at them now, you think that they're quite pedestrian. But then I suppose that in the history of this thing, that's exactly what you'd expect. Little baby steps.
Right.
Before we actually get to these fantastic, rich realizations that we have now. Yeah, so yeah, just like I said, make 20 Chaos Warriors, and then I think Brian got a license to do Middle Earth. which I think hung on the back of the Ralph Bakshi cartoon.
Right.
Um, if memory serves me right, I think when Ralph Bakshi got the deal with uh, the Tolkien Enterprises people, they allowed him to make the film and any other stuff that he wanted. So on the back of that license, Brian got in, and we made. Oh, so I did the Rohirrim, I did Sauron, I did what else did I do? Boromir. The twins did things like the dwarves. They did, Gandalf, all that sort of thing. Um, yeah, yeah. Nick Bibby did the Balrog, which was a beautiful model.
Right.
Um, yeah, yeah. So that was what we did, and that was probably in the first year and a bit, something like that, and it just went on from there. There was a
Sure.
D&D license that we had, a
Of
D&D, I
course.
should say, and did a lot of work for that. Did the for me mostly it was the monsters, Githyanki, the humanoid monsters rather than the big, larger than human size ones. Did a lot of them. Uh, did some of the characters for them. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it was just a real melting pot, at that point. But predominantly fantasy.
Right.
You know, I mean, science fiction was not a dirty word, but it wasn't far off being a dirty word.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting then, because obviously, I think at Naismith Designs you did do some fantasy miniatures as well, didn't
Yes,
you?
we did.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And again, that was just the case of us saying, well, you could see in magazines like Military Modeling that there were people like Asgard and making stuff like this. And we just wanted to be there too. We wanted to be in the
Right.
marketplace. So, yeah, I pushed for that, and I made some fantasy figures. I'd say fantasy, but they were because we were just so generic.
Right.
We weren't basing anything on a specific rule set or a specific mythos. We were just like throwing out. It's kind of like a general menu of of
Sure.
of design
Yeah.
that people could pick and choose from. Of course, what that meant, there was only one or two of each design. So,
Right.
so it was quite limited um, when we did that with Naismith Design. But I enjoyed that. Oh, I did some work, a little bit of work for Hinchcliffe. Remember Hinchcliffe?
Oh, right. Sure. Yeah. So the
Yeah, yeah,
historicals
yeah.
there
They
as
did
well.
primarily historical stuff, and it was great. And that was one of the main historical war game
Hmm.
figure manufacturers in our day. And at that point, I did a little bit of work with them and made what they called the X range, which was a fantasy. And it was just a mix, just a
Right.
random mix. I remember making like Henry VIII and then doing a kind of dragon woman or something, So it was
Right.
completely off the wall. There was no rhyme or reason for it.
Sure. Yeah, because I'm guessing that there just wasn't the sort of, I mean, IPs, I guess, like worlds like Warhammer, and obviously things like Lord of the Rings existed, but
Yeah.
even that, I'm guessing, didn't have a clear, defined visual identity like
No,
it does
no,
today.
and in a way, it was kind of good and bad because a lot of the games like say RuneQuest or D&D were still role playing games at their
Mm,
heart. So you didn't really need to have lots of figures. You didn't, and it was okay to be able to have different figures from different manufacturers because that just added to the specialness of the game. And,
right.
and to be fair to Citadel at the time, they were quite happy with that. We were able to exploit lots of different manufacturers' figures and stuff, and when we were doing games.
Mm,
So yeah, it was a much more easygoing, fluid, and open setup. But
sure.
because of that, it couldn't fuel the kind of levels of kind of production levels and so on that we see now. Where where
Mm,
where people are investing in armies, and they're putting a lot of money in. In those days, you would have most people would have like an army, one, you
mm,
know, um, a historical army. They might have two, but essentially that was quite a lot of money because, when you were buying metal miniatures, you had to spend, two or £300, which back in the day was a lot
Mm.
of money. So consequently, if you were fed up with your medievals and you wanted to go and do some Napoleonic, what you would probably do is sell the old army and use the funds to invest in the new one. And that was generally speaking how it went. But as far as fantasy was concerned, it was still very much, just picking the odd cherry
Mm.
from the tree, whether it was from a Citadel tree or a Ralpartha tree. It didn't really matter.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, I get you. Yeah. Did you play a lot of games at that time yourself?
I've always loved games. I'm
Mm.
absolutely terrible at playing them. There's something I'm always the guy that gets beat because some other person clearly sees how to exploit the rules and how to make him or herself more or less invincible.
Mm.
So I never really won many. I did enjoy playing them, and as a kind of designer, it was invaluable, absolutely invaluable to play and to see how the models were being used on the table, how you could see how roughly they were treated.
Mm.
I mean, the old metal figures, when you go back on the day, the reason why they were so chunky and stocky and why the weapons were so thick and large was partly because the casting medium that was used was not very great quality. So you couldn't really get a huge amount of detail from it. Also, it had to be quite robust because people would just scoop the models up with their hands, and because they were metal, they'd be quite heavy. So it was the way they were treated was why they were the way they were.
Mm.
And that's what they were. They were tokens. They were little gaming pieces. They might be beautiful, but they were still gaming pieces.
Sure.
And that sort of insight when you were playing the games was really good.
Mm.
And later on, when I got to work at Citadel, although I wasn't on the shop floor or the manufacturing, we had a close liaison, if you like, between the mold makers and the casters and ourselves, so that if we were making a figure that was just causing them grief or heartache because I don't know, if it was covered in spikes or the way it was molded meant that the molds were only lasting half as long, then that was a real cost,
Mm.
real cost. I remember at that time, I think, I think on average, the casting metal was something like £3,000 per ton, per
Right.
metric ton. So if you made a figure which was just 5 or 10% taller, you were probably doubling the amount of material that you needed, therefore doubling its cost.
Right.
And that again became an economic consideration for us. So we were encouraged to think carefully when we were making our models, and that's why a lot of the larger models, of course, were kits.
Right.
Why, as an example, the very first dreadnought that I made for 40K
Mm.
is the one with the two sort of like spherical type shoulders,
Sure.
and then the arms, and then the body itself is really just the head and the ring which captures the shoulder pieces, and then the ring below which captures the legs. And we did that because I did that because I wanted to save the weight of all that metal. If we just made that body a solid piece,
Mm.
it would have probably meant that people had to pay maybe twice as much money for it. But
Right.
because we were able to lighten the model, get some of that metal out of there, that gave us a product then that was more viable. And even when Jez did his, it was the same thing. It was still a kit. And essentially what we were trying to do was capture space as much as possible with as little material as possible. Do you know?
Sure.
So that was part of the design ethic.
That's fascinating then. So was that, I mean, is that, I mean, you said that you were encouraged to kind of think in those terms then. Is that something that Brian Ansell was sort of putting out
Yeah,
there
yeah,
and
yeah, Brian.
saying
These
we need 20 Chaos Warriors, but be mindful of,
Yes, he
big they
would.
are?
Yes, yes. He and Alan Merritt, who was the kind of production manager, um, who was our main kind of line manager, if you like.
Right.
Um, he would be not reluctant to tell us that we were making things too big or too heavy, or demanding too much of the mold,
Mm,
that kind of thing. So yeah, it was all part. It was part of the training, if
mm,
you like, because it was. I suppose you could say it was on the job training because no one there was no college for figure design.
mm.
I don't even know if there is such a thing now. Maybe there is.
Sure, yeah, I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think
Oh,
there's a
well.
lot of internal training still, isn't there, in the sort of big companies that
Aye,
they.
yeah, it's probably like a bit of a black art. But
Mm,
nowadays it's changed so much. It's
right,
changed hugely, computers,
of
3D,
course.
CAD, all of that has meant that there's a huge number of people making just beautiful, beautiful models. I mean, I've always thought of myself as a accomplished journeyman, but when I look at other people and you see how beautiful and artistic the models are, sometimes they're a bit impractical. Hey, but because we're now working in a world of printing, 3D printing, and in plastic, you can achieve things and you can have design aims that we could never have entertained back in the day because, as I said, metal was expensive and manufacturing was expensive, and
Sure.
if you made a big model kit like Tony Ackland, Tony was an illustrator
Mm,
for the most part, but his hobby was making models.
right.
And he loved making things like dragons. And he would come in with these masters that he'd made, and the dragon would be like, I don't know, like 12 inches long. And it was beautiful, but it just weighed a ton, And
Right.
even when it was cut up and made into a kit, which he eventually did, to reassemble it was a craft all of its own, really just to get them. So yeah, but I think they're quite sought after now,
Mm,
you know.
yeah.
And some of the other stuff that he did as well. I think he's still doodling as well, as far as I know.
Sure.
You
Yeah.
know.
And it's, I mean, incredibly influential art there
Oh,
from
aye, yeah,
Tony as
yeah,
well, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah. I think Tony's kind of baroque detailing and stuff kind of went through. Especially you were talking about things like the Beastmen.
Sure.
The Beastmen, the elves. All of those things that really obviously clicked with him, and he loved drawing stuff like that. You
Yeah.
know, so yeah, he was he and John, of course, were the main um, artistic sources,
Mm.
if you like, for that kind of thing.
That must
And
have been quite interesting sort of space to be working then, as because obviously you mentioned before you're kind of given free reign in terms of miniature creation,
mm,
but then as the sort of Citadel business is kind of taking a bit more shape and growing and sort of formalizing a little bit more, the
yes,
world is formalizing as well, isn't it?
oh
Warhammer
yeah,
becomes more of a
yeah,
setting. So
yeah.
how did that sort of function? How did that feel as you were maybe
Um,
having less freedom,
for
perhaps?
me, it probably was one of the things that contributed to me not being a Games Workshop sculptor anymore because it
Right.
was it was so it was at that point where the ship that was the Games Workshop design thing and manufacturing thing was just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And when I got onto the boat, it was like a small agile craft that could steer around and make sharp turns and dodge over and went really fast. But by the time I left, it was already quite a big barge,
Hmm.
that could really only go straight. And if you wanted it to turn, you could only turn very gradually. And now it's even more so. It's like a giant oil tanker, um,
Sure.
which just moves with such grace and predictability that
Hmm.
it doesn't. And there's no room. I don't think there is. Maybe there is, and they're keeping that under wraps. Who knows? But I think the main engine for production is let's make more Space Marines.
Right.
Let's change them in some way because that's really what what they're doing. And I suppose, they've got shareholders to look after now, and all these things have changed. Whereas when I was working there, the company was owned basically by Brian, by Steve and Ian, Keith Winfold, and even after they sold out, it was Tom Kirby's. It was still idiosyncratic. You could just decide, I want to do this, and then we just go off and do that.
Sure.
Whereas now, it's a much more. You've got to be ever so careful. And I think that's kind of why it's Space Marine City, really.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, and what they've done is amazing. Wow.
Of course,
When you
yeah.
look at it,
The
you
scale
know.
of it, yeah, it is an incredible success story from
Oh
where
gosh,
you guys
yes,
were starting, isn't it? I
yeah.
mean, you mentioned there, like you might on a whim be like, I really want to do this, I really want to do that. Were there any particular things that struck you as like this is
Well,
an idea I want to
me,
pursue?
I was always a sci-fi buff. I always loved when I was a
Right.
student. I used to love reading, Edok Smith and Asimov and all the Heinlein and all these kind of classic sci-fi books.
Mm.
And and if I did any gaming, it was usually board gaming, And I used to play Avalon Hill stuff like Starship Troopers
Mm.
or the SPI games, Star Soldier, Star Force, all these things. And so my mind was quite excited by the science fiction thing, whereas Workshop at the time I was there, certainly in the early years, was mainly fantasy,
Right.
and fantasy was the rule. And the sculptors loved making fantasy models, which was great. But it did mean that there was a certain there was an inertia that you had to overcome if you wanted to make science fiction stuff. Now, I
Right.
loved making it, so any opportunity was great, and because Brian was into like developing games of all sorts, and licenses.
Mm.
We did a game for Rogue Trooper,
Mm.
which was the comic strip from 2000 AD. We did, so I made the model for that. I mean, I remember I made a master for Daleks because we did Doctor Who. The twins had already done the Daleks, but it's one of these things that had to be remade and remade. So I did some of them.
Right.
What else did we do like that? Battle cars we did. I did those. Again, there was, like I say, the guys who were making the fantasy figures were really keen to continue doing that, and like I think they saw things like science fiction as just like too much of a distraction.
Mm.
But then when Brian asked Rick to look at doing science fiction game called Rogue Trader, that's when I thought, oh, this is great, fantastic, I love this, and so I kind of, as much as I could, I got myself involved in that, and did some of the early play testing on John Stallard's floor with Rick. That was really good fun. And at that time, like I say, because it was so fluid, you could you could you could contribute in so many ways. So you weren't just a sculptor. You could
Mm.
suggest things in the game. You could suggest mechanics. I mean, one of the things about being a designer is you're a visual beast, and Rick, although he's a talented guy, is in that case was like a rules writer, a generator for a system.
Mm.
So we would say, well, yeah, that'd be great, but if we could have a visual impact, a visual representation of the thing that you want in your rules, then we could do that. And he'd say, oh, okay, then, and then we'd work together. The designers and he would work together to make that. So that was the joy of being in this small, sleek, agile craft that Games Workshop was back in those days.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like a really interesting place. I'm fascinated by the fact that it was obviously a place of incredible creativity, a lot of creative talent working
Yeah.
together, but also that business mindset that you mentioned earlier was at work
Why?
as well. And those
Yeah, yeah,
two
yeah.
things at the same time. I mean, that's quite rare, I would imagine, to get to get the strengths in both sides.
I think, yeah, there was all sorts of things going on there because obviously Brian and Keith, when they bought out Steve and Ian, so that they then owned Games Workshop at that time. Presumably they did it on the back of some gargantuan loan from an investment company. So they had to generate funds. So that was one of the reasons why Brian was really keen that we'd have massive releases every month. And at that point, I was the manager of the designers. Someone had to be, and I just put my hand up, and I said, "Okay, I'll do that." So I was in charge of that, which meant I didn't do a lot of sculpting in the later years. Everyone else was doing it, and I was trying to organise that. But at that point, Brian was looking for something like 150 and 200 models per month.
Wow.
Which was huge. And the only way we could do it really was things like head swaps, body swaps, things like that. So I would, of an evening, what I'd probably do is I'd take some of the twins space dwarves that they'd made and take them home, cut all the heads off, cut the guns off, swap everything around and put some green stuff back in and bring them in. And then we'd put them back into the system again. Right. So when you look at things like the range of dwarves as an example, or the Imperial Army, which wasn't the Space Marines, you can see that obviously there's been a lot of what I call cut and shut. A lot of mixing of existing sculpts. So I never really sculpted on these models. I didn't want to do that because these models were the twins models, not mine. So all I was doing was just rearranging them, and that was great because it meant that we could hit Brian's target and we were able to generate that sort of stuff. And that was when obviously plastic started to raise its head, because plastic, as I said, metal was about £3,000 a ton, plastic was about £1,000 a ton. So you could see why, and it was lighter. So per product, it was a lot more economically efficient to consider moving to plastic. And when 40K or Rogue Trader, as it started, began, that's where the plastic Space Marines came from. Was the idea of let's invest, make a mold that can make a set of models that will be the launch box, if you like, for the set, for the whole thing.
Sure.
So it was hugely exciting. Really great time to be involved with them.
Yeah, I'm curious about that. Just on the sort of reworked models, that mean that you wouldn't be able to recast the original sort of range then. So if you've chopped and changed a load of the early guys, or could you
what and go back?
Yeah.
No, you wouldn't be able to. No, in truth,
Right.
no. The way it worked was you would send a set of greens off to Eastwood. They would very carefully make an original master mold.
Right.
And the master mold would be spun maybe only 15 or 20 times. And every one of those castings was used as a production master. So what you would then do is say you made 20 dwarves and you'd spin them all 20 times. So you had 20 of each dwarf and you used those 20 castings to make the production molds. So the original master mold, if you like, became the record of the model, and under those circumstances. But, at that time, because we were looking for just sheer quantities of models, that was okay. I mean, that wasn't a decision at my level. That was done by the others. But yeah, that was in practice how it worked. So you're right. The models, the original model, Model 1, if you like, would not exist anymore because the head was already on Model 3.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. And then you mentioned the sort of move into into plastics then? Because you had a hand in sort of working with Brian
Yeah,
Ansell and John
again,
Thornthwaite
I'd
and others,
said to
right?
Brian I was really fascinated by the plastics, the whole idea of it,
Mm,
the engineering of it, the problem solving of it. Obviously, initially, we started off doing game components, slaughter bases and things like that, which largely was down to people like John Thornthwaite, who at that time was a kind of, if you like, working in a consultant capacity
mm.
for Workshop, but eventually became an employee and became the plastics production manager, if you like. And John's still about, but he's not doing any of this stuff anymore. And so he was the one who brought the plastic know-how into Games Workshop. He used to work at Bluebird and Peter Pan, all those Matchbox,
Right.
so he knew all the people who were the tool makers and the pattern makers, and he could introduce us to the people who would help us, making the models. But we'd always did the original sculpts, so we
Right.
we take them because at that time I remember the pattern making outfit that we used most of the time was an outfit called Milliber, and they were a high quality engineering grade pattern maker
Right.
down in Ashford in Kent, and they would make I don't know, the dashboard for the latest Jaguar car,
Right.
or the steering wheels, or the gear stick knobs, or the internal panels, or all of this stuff, and it was all absolutely beautiful and perfect. And then we came along with this lump of clay. Yeah, can you do something with this? So they were at first they were bemused, and then they started to get a hold of it. It was an expensive process because as we were sculptors, we were not schooled in the technology that you needed to be aware of for things like the split lines and the undercuts that you can create very easily when you're sculpting a model in the round. And so they would have to crawl all over our models and resolve them in a way that made them viable.
Right.
And then they would make the resin that would be then passed to the toolmaker. So it was a long and involved process. I mean, probably I would say 3 to 4 months between a sculpt leaving the studio to us seeing a first test of the plastic.
Wow.
By which time, of course, it was too late, and we'd spent like £30,000 or something like that. So it was quite scary. But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
usually we did okay. We did okay. We got a few things wrong, but not all of things wrong.
Are there any memorable mistakes or disasters that you can think of?
There was one I remember we did in the first Blood Bowl set, I think. Something went wrong with the foot on the human player because we only had one model,
Right.
and I think because we had left the pattern maker to solve the problem, they'd solved the problem okay, but what they'd done is they because the foot was twisted, they'd re-sculpted it in a way that made it look just like broken, basically.
Right.
By which point, the technology meant that the only thing we could do was to remove metal from the mold, which would add plastic to the model
Right.
because you were working in the negative. So I had to go down and I had to amend the resin negatively to try to fix the foot, you know.
Right.
We kind of got there, I mean, if you looked at it in detail now, you think, oh yeah, I can see it now. But yeah, so there was the odd thing like that.
Right.
But generally speaking, they were not too bad. So many people were interested in looking at the models that they they usually trapped most of the problems, and although it was a bit of a nightmare sometimes to fix them, by the time they went off to be made into patterns, they were pretty much what we wanted and pretty close to what we needed.
Right.
We did also. We had some great fun. We did the plastics. There was a team up with Milton Bradley,
Right.
who were part of the Hasbro operation, and we did HeroQuest, and that was quite good fun because we did it in the same way that we did the Space Marines. I, as the design manager at the time, said to the sculptors, "Well, we need to make these Space Marines. Who would like to get involved?" And so Jez put his hand up, and Ali Morrison put his hand up, and the twins put their hands up. So we sat, and it was like a little old lady's sewing bee, where you had like one big table, and all the models were in the middle, and so no one actually could say, "I made that figure," because we all picked each thing up and worked on it, and we did it like that in the round, and we did that also with the HeroQuest stuff for the most part. There were some models that I made just because we needed them at the end. The undead, the skeletons, the mummy, I think, and some of the key, like the barbarian figure. The twins did the dwarf. I think Jez did most of the elf, and Ali did the fighter or the ranger. I can't remember. I think it was the ranger. And that was great. But I remember working at that time. All the sculptors were in town in Enfield Chambers, which was right in the middle of Nottingham, and I was based out at Eastwood. And I had there to help me, I had John Thornthwaite, and I had Dave Andrews, who's still there, bless him. And we were involved, and we had to make all the furniture pieces. I don't know if you remember HeroQuest.
I do, amazing pieces.
It was, so we would make the top, say the top for the wardrobe or the top for the table, and then the vertical design was a piece of cardboard that you just plugged in underneath that was printed. So we had to make all these bits on the top. And I remember we had to supply, and Hasbro said, "Okay, just send us 2 castings of everything." Well, that scared the pants off us because we were so used to making little models, and even if we made 3 ups, they were probably about 90 millimeters tall, so they were quite small. And then we'd made these bits of furniture and then they said we need them 3 up, so we had to make them, and they were like about 15 inches, and then we had to make a rubber mold of them. And I remember we got this, we ordered a whole load of silicon, and we mixed it, and we poured it, and we waited for it to set, and it didn't set. I was, oh no, because our masters were in the middle of all this gunk. So eventually I had to call it, and we had to say, this rubber's just not working. So we had to clean it all off, and poor Dave got the job of cleaning all this rubber off. And eventually we did it. We managed, but it was quite an expensive mistake, as I recall.
Right.
But yeah, making, that was part of the magic and the enjoyment I had at Workshop, was like doing all this different stuff. It was great.
Yeah. Yeah, and those, just thinking of those HeroQuest models, and then Space Crusade that came later, of course, with MB. Incredible models. And just when you were putting those together, because some of the pieces for, especially Space Crusade, but some of the HeroQuest expansions were like push fit as well.
Yes.
You'd get some weapons that would go in.
Yes,
Would
yeah.
that be handled by the pattern makers as well? The sort of sprue
No, we
guys?
did a lot of that.
Right.
We did a lot of that ourselves. They would do the final engineering, but we would make allowances for them. So
Right.
generally speaking, what we would do is we'd make a peg fit undersized, so it was loose.
Right.
And then what then would happen is that the toolmaker could then, at his discretion, increase the size of the pin in order to make it fit. But the actual location and the design and the link up between, say, the guns and the model, that was at our end. We did that. There was one, the HeroQuest, I think the orcs I think it was the orcs. We only made one orc, but they wanted to have different designs. So I remember we made the orc, and I think it had no arm, but we designed several arms with several swords. So then what they could do is they could copy the body of the orc into the steel, and then they would get the resin for the arm of Orc 1, and they would cut that in and join it all up. So that was done at the tool making stage rather than at the sculpting age. So we were doing everything we could to maximize the output but with least effort, you know. So yeah, that was a cost control thing. But yeah, and again, you know, because it worked, it was just a great way to work, you know. So it was great fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you were talking before just about your love for sci-fi and the introduction of
Hmm.
Rogue Trader and all that sort of stuff. There were some science fiction models before Rogue Trader came out that would then sort of be grandfathered into Rogue Trader and 40k, weren't there?
Yes,
Including your original LE2 limited edition 2
yes,
Imperial
yeah,
Marine, Space Marine. I mean,
yeah.
do you? I'm sure you've talked about that particular model, iconic model, a lot, but I guess I'm curious how you felt about it at the time, and whether or not you had any inkling about like how important it would become.
No, in truth, I mean, not really. I remember basically what happened was I remember going to, again, I was the person who was like wanting to do sci-fi, wanting to do it. And so I remember going to speak to Rick about, you know, he explained that what they needed was this figure, which was like the basic soldier, the grunt, who was going to be the core of the army. And for me to just go off and go on with it, really. So that's what I did. And I remember making it alongside making lots of other things. And I did enjoy it. And then I remember Brian or Alan coming up and saying, good job, well done. You know, we think you've nailed it there. I thought, oh, that's fine. And then I just carried on making something else. And it was only later on they said, right, we need to make some more. So then I started making, I think I made a set of about 7 or 10 Space Marines. And then that was the time when I became in charge of the designers. So my design time was just gobbled up with admin and all that stuff. So I couldn't really get bench time to make anymore. So I think Ali started making them,
Right.
Ali Morrison. And, you know, you can see, you can always, like children, you can look at the models and you can say, oh, that's an Ali one, or that's a
Sure.
Trish one, or it's a twins, you know,
Sure.
and you can spot them a mile off. And I think you can see the difference between the ones I'd made, because they were like my sculpts, and the ones that Ali made. And then Jez came in, and he started doing, I think, first of all, he started doing Terminators, because Space Hulk was one of the models that we'd come out with. And I did the sculpts for Space Hulk, the original game, the Gene Stealers, and the Terminators. But in both cases, they were an amalgam of design input from Jez and myself.
Right.
Jez, after the game came out, then went on to make, you know, the Terminator metal models that are kind of so iconic now. And probably on the back of that was able to start exploiting that look, you know, and making it. And as my input design wise was becoming less and less and less, Jezzy's input then was becoming greater and stronger. And you know, I mean, I don't know, because I've not really been part of the workshop machine, but it seems to me that over the last 30 odd years, you know, that Jez and John and those core individuals have contributed a whole load of the uniqueness and the design
Sure. Yeah.
ethos that makes the model so good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of designs though that trace their origins right the way back to that era that you were working on them and putting them together. I mean, even like you said, the Gene Stealers, yes, they have changed and evolved slightly, but a lot of the core visual identity remains the same today as it did from then. From
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah,
Space
yeah.
Hulk
I mean,
set.
we of course had to be careful, because Space Hulk came out probably about a year or two after Alien, or
Right.
either Alien or Aliens. I can't remember which. So we were sensitive to the whole IP issue, and I remember they asked me to make a plastic 3-up for like a let's call it a hive queen. And I made this model, and I was really pleased with it. It was a fully functional plastic kit. And I made it, and I remember showing it to them, and then it all went quiet for about 2 or 3 weeks. And I remember Alan saying, "I don't think we can use it." He said it's just too close to the aliens IP.
Right.
So they were, and that was a shame, I think, because that was a good model.
So
Probably
that's
in a
just
bit,
lost to time
just
then.
lost to time now.
Yeah.
It's gone.
Wow. Yeah.
There may be pictures of it somewhere in the archive.
Mm.
And they might have the parts, but again, though, in those days, the models were made from not from green stuff, which is how they were made before CAD came in. But they were made in using a stuff called foam board, which was a technology we borrowed from the pattern making industry for cars, and it was this kind of like fine grained modular board that you could cut, saw, sand, finish, and you could use that, and it was very strong. And you could use that and then apply maybe a skin of clay over it to put the detail on. So a lot of the models then were made in that way, and that the alien queen person thing was built just like that. But those kind of materials don't survive very long. They dry out, they warp. All sorts of things happen to them. So I'd be surprised even if they exist, whether they were viable. I doubt it.
Right. Sure. That's fascinating then, though. So would that be just for models of a certain scale? Because
it was intended to be part of the Space Hulk.
Right. Oh, okay. Right.
So yeah, so it was going to be used. I think, yeah. Whether it was it for us or was it Space Crusade? I don't think it was Space Crusade.
Right.
Because obviously we did a lot of work on Space Crusade. I did the dreadnoughts, the kind of walkers things for them as well. I did those, and the guns, and it was just fantastic times. Because each project was maybe, I don't know, 4 to 6 weeks, and then you would finish that and you'd go off and do something else. So really, really exciting stuff. And I think the other thing as well that I don't know if the guys enjoy so much now is that you could see a product through in its entirety, from concepts, from sorting out drawings, getting them approved, to the making, to the approval, to speaking to any of the engineers you needed to speak to if it was plastics, solving all of those issues. You could see it through yourself. Whereas now, I think because, as I said, the system is so smooth and so ordered, there are people whose entire job it is to just speak to the engineers, or someone's job is to, I don't know, for sculpting, they've got like guys who are great at making skulls or great at making swords, and they just make skulls and swords all day digitally, and then they give them over to someone else who uses them in the model. So it's a different experience now. I'm sure that there are core creatives in the middle of all this who are doing the initial generation of design, but they're probably very few and really quite special, I think.
Well, speaking of that sort of a broader talent, I guess you did some illustration, some like painting and artwork for the early games.
Yeah, I mean at that time, I mean in the same way that the sculptors were being pressured to generate as much material 3D as they could, so also the design studio there was producing all the art and all the pre-production for White Dwarf magazine, for all the games, for all the publicity stuff, for all the sales stuff. So they had a very full schedule as well. And because of that, John, who was in charge, John Blanche, was always having trouble finding people who who could contribute, who could make the art, and especially make the art that was suitable for Games Workshop.
Mm.
So in the in the sculptors, who were all kind of artists in one way or another anyway, you had people who had a firm grasp of what a model looked like and a firm grasp of the masses and the volumes that are involved. And therefore, when they drew something, they more or less drew a model,
Mm.
so it meant that it was a good source for John to use. So he used me, he used Ali, he used Trish, he used Jez, Nick. Trying to think. I don't think Kevin did much. Colin Dixon did because he was always kind of had a foot in both camps. Yeah, and it was that was good. It was good for us because we got a little. We were paid on the side for that, so that was great. And yeah, did all sorts. I did blister cards, did some of the internal art for Rogue Trader, the original book,
Sure, yeah.
like the headers and the footers and some of the diagrams and stuff. Also, because I was drawing in such a three-dimensional manner, John would use me to generate pencil roughs that would then be sent off to other artists to ink up and apply their own artistic thing onto, but
Right.
doing it in a way that meant that the drawing still looked like a model. So quite a lot of the black and white illustrations that are in 40K are like that. They started off as my pencil roughs that then went off and were used by others. As you say, I did the Golden Demon one, which again was
Yeah.
John was it was Christmas, just before Christmas. John had the pressure on him. He said, "We need a box for this paint set, and I don't have anyone who can do it." And I said, I'll have a go at that. I'll do that. So he said, okay. So I got a piece of board and I took some paints home and over Christmas painted that model. I mean, I enjoy painting, but I'm nothing like as good as these guys now. But I really enjoyed it. And I remember I wanted it to be as red as it could possibly be. So I remember I used, bottles and bottles of red ink, putting washes of red ink and then another wash of red ink and then maybe some yellow and then more red, to make it as vibrant as I could. And yeah, and it was great. The original design for the demon, I think it was Nick Bibby. Because we had back in the day, it was originally it was either the giveaway or the consolation prize model for people who entered one of the early painting competitions, and
Right.
I think I got Nick to sculpt this beautiful. It's probably about 50 mil, maybe 55, 60 mil model, and that became the kind of the design resource for making all those pictures and so on. So I borrowed heavily from Nick's design to make the ones, and I did a couple of sets of box art for that. Did some work for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Some of the color plates in there. Then did some daft things like I remember we did Gothic Horror because we also had a big link up with Chaosium and Call of Cthulhu.
Right.
So we were supporting that, and I did some pieces that were game aids, like floor plans and things like that.
Sure,
So
of course, yeah.
that was, yeah. So it's just again, it contributes to that idea that it was just a complete mishmash of 2D, 3D stuff, talking to people, just, yeah, just, I'm sure that if you were able to speak to, I don't know, the people who were in the studios when, I don't know, the Beatles or the Who or whoever it was were recording, it would be the same kind of vibe, that same kind of, anything is possible, and if I can speak to these three people, then we'll make it happen. Whereas now, of course, you don't even know where they live, and they could be in Hong Kong or whatever. So that's much more difficult, much more tricky. But in those days, it was accessible and possible, and yeah, fantastic, great times.
I mean, just looking at the sort of history and a different kind of cultural impact. But you mentioned like the Beatles recording in the studio. This essentially was that. This is the Beatles recording in the studio, but for miniature games. For the hobby,
Yeah. It was just fantastic. It was great, and I really enjoyed it because I had a really facile, quick, really quick at making models. Whereas someone like Jez and I were kind of like at opposite ends of the scale like that. Jez was a very considered, very organized person, and I don't know, but I guess he's probably still got sketchbooks for the models that he made 30, 40 years ago. Well, I don't have a sketchbook because I just made them. They were, there was one time. That's what it was. Richard Halliwell had game designer, did Space Hulk, a lot of Warhammer fantasy roleplay stuff. Great guy. And he had designed a scenario for Warhammer fantasy roleplay, which was a loose take on Shakespeare's Macbeth. And it was called Macdeath. Right. And there were zombies in it. But also because it was set in Scotland, he had in the set a gang of Highlanders tossing cabers. And we didn't have any of them anywhere. So, and we knew we needed them for this kind of pressured release. We needed to have figures ready. So I remember I sat down and I think in one day I made seven Highlanders in kilts tossing cabers, at a time when we were probably even then taking about 1 to 2 days to make a model, so it was like, just get it done. So that was what I always thought was one of my strengths, was being able to just like respond, kind of like a plumber or something. Someone said, you need your tap fixed. Okay, I'll go and fix it. And you just like that kind of attitude. Whereas, Jez was, oh, what kind of tap is it? And and have a long discussion about it, and it would be really good and probably much better than my tap. But that was a kind of maybe a way of explaining the differences. And I just enjoyed that, being able to solve things quickly and make things happen. It was grand.
And obviously you moved on from Citadel and Games Workshop and have had an extensive career since then. You've also moved into the digital realm in terms of your sculpting now, haven't you?
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, it's kind of hard to resist, really. Just after I left Games Workshop, I had a phone call from a customer of mine in America, Russ Dunaway from Old Glory.
Right.
And he had been approached by an outfit called Freeform. And he said, have you heard of these people? I said, no. And he said, they are the people who create this software for sculpting models inside a computer. And I went, oh, that's really interesting. He said, they've been talking to Games Workshop, because it was at that time, just after I left, that they really went big on the digital stuff. And so they were going in to speak to them. Now, of course, I was living in Nottingham. Games Workshop was in Nottingham. So I phoned the Freeform office and I said, hey, yeah, I understand you're coming to do a demonstration there. Do you think you could come to my house and do the same? So they did, bless them. And there was about 6 of them, and they were all suits, all men and women, looking like they're just in Wall Street or something. And they came in and they had a computer and they set it up and demonstrated the system and the haptic mouse and all that sort of thing. And I was won over. So after they left, I went and thought about it. I spoke to my wife. We reconstructed our finances because it was not cheap. not cheap at all, to invest in this stuff. Obviously, for workshop as a business, it was fine, but for an individual, it was a big step. So I did that, and I started with that. I also started with ZBrush pretty much from the moment it started. I think I've got version 1.03 somewhere on a disk. And it's come on by leaps and bounds, like so much of the software now, and it's great fun. Every one of these platforms is great for doing something and rubbish at doing something else. So you have to be, once you learn what their strengths and weaknesses are, you can you do the good thing with that platform, and then you port it over to another platform, do what you need to do in that one, and then back again, or you might use another system. So that's one of the things that I do enjoy making, and I enjoy making my own stuff. I enjoy making stuff for customers. Yeah, all sorts of things. I do. Other work as well. I do work for, there's a chap I know who does models for model aircraft. So I do models for that, digital pilots and things like that, and engines. Yeah, and it's all grist to the mill. Hang on, I'll show you one. Hold on. So this is a rough print of a. Oop, there you go.
Right. Because it's big.
It's big, yeah, but it's hollow. It's the thickness of this stuff is only about 1.5 millimeters, and it's very light.
Wow.
And of course, for model aircraft, radio controlled model aircraft, it's really important that the center of gravity stays where it should be. So if you made a model like that and it weighed 2 or 3 kilos, you could upset the balance of the model. So consequently, printing in FDM, which is how those are printed, it's a fused deposit system. In other words, you have like a spaghetti-like thread of plastic that's fed through a hot nozzle that melts the plastic, and then the nozzle is moved on a raster, which is essentially like a printer, and it builds up by layers and makes these models. And when they're finished, they're really robust and light.
Are they? Because you'd imagine it would be like an egg shell almost.
Yeah, it is. Structurally, it's exactly like an eggshell, but it's it's essentially uses an ABS plastic, which isn't unlike Lego.
Right.
So it's really strong.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's not structurally. We've had some people saying, "Could you make tires?" There's a chap who'd made a Vulcan bomber in 1/4 scale, which means that the Vulcan bomber model is about 45 feet long.
Right.
And he wanted us to make the tires for it. And I said, we can make the pattern. We can do that. But what I don't want to do is have your £200,000 model crash and burn because my rubber tires have got the wrong consistency or something. I'm not interested in that. So I don't mind making pilots and things because they're just decorative. They're not a functional part of the model. So that's another thing. We're doing all sorts of daft, crazy things. I think that's the great thing about digital, is that it's expanded the world hugely. I mean, if I make a model now, I know that I'm in competition, if you like, professional competition with people who are in the Philippines, with people who are in America, with people who are in Europe, and they have got phenomenal skills. I mean, I am self-taught, so I don't have the layered education in how to use these programs that, say, a 30-year-old man might have. So I've got my own way of making the stuff. I'm too old a dog to learn new tricks, I think. So I make things the way I do, and if they're suitable, great, and if they're not, that's fine too. You know,
Well, I imagine a lot of the people who are looking for that kind of stuff want exactly that, don't they? They will want the Naismith character
yeah, I
to
mean,
come
and I
through, right?
enjoy that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I find it's amusing that when I look at a lot of my digital pieces, they they look alarmingly like models that I would have sculpted 30 years ago. You know, and I remember Brian Ansell saying to me that he said he firmly believed that all sculptors, when they're making figures, are really making themselves. So it's true, and I think that, you know, when you look at, say, Jez's elves, I don't know if you have ever met Jez, but he's a slender. Well, last time I saw him, he was slender, a slender man,
Right.
um, and very precise, and he looks like an elf. You know, whereas I look like a kind of like a Highlander that should be tossing a caber or something like that. You know, so you know, and Ali has his own look too. You know,
Mm.
yeah. So so from that point of view, I think it's right that even although it's still a digital process and you're still using a computer to make something, it still ends up looking uncannily as if you'd sculpted it out of green stuff,
Right.
which is odd. But no, I love it, and I do it as my hobby. Really, you
Mm.
know, I always consider myself lucky that I started doing this as a hobby. I've been able to enjoy making a living out of it for all this time, and here I am still doing it pretty much as a hobby.
Mm.
Really, you know, obviously I'm still a freelance, and if anyone wants me to do work, I'm here.
Mm.
But primarily, I just puttle along, and if someone asks me to do stuff, I am more than delighted and happy to help if I can. You know, but you know, yeah, it's great as long as my eyes and my hands are still working.
Yeah.
You know,
Amazing. Well, Bob, it has been absolutely wonderful to chat with you. Thank you so much for
no
taking the
worries.
time.
Yeah, no worries. And if you want to do this again, you know, I'm sure there's other things we can chat about. Um,
I'll bet
you
there
know,
is, yeah.
yeah. Oh God, yeah. Oh, there's yeah, I mean, all the people I've worked with since leaving Games Workshop,
Mm.
obviously people are interested in that because that's the biggest potato on the table. But there's lots of other quite interesting
Of course.
little things we can pick up on
Yeah.
in the future if you wish.
Yeah, you bet. That sounds great.
All right then, you.
Enormous thanks to Bob for joining me to talk about his amazing career and his awesome work with Citadel and beyond. If you would like to find out more about Bob's current activity and current sculpting opportunities, check out his website that I've linked in the description below. I would also like to thank my Patreons for helping me to prep for this interview. If you would like to become a patron and support the work I do here on the channel, researching and documenting the history of Games Workshop, and interviewing the amazing folks who are involved, then please consider checking out my Patreon. There's a link down in the description below. You will get early and exclusive access to content and the opportunity to help me with lots of different exciting projects and read my living research posts as well. It is the only way I'm able to keep doing this work, and I am hugely appreciative and very grateful to anybody who can offer any degree of support. It is also really helpful if you can like and comment on this video and maybe share it with other folks who you think might be interested, because that really does help to get people viewing the content and finding out about the channel. Thank you once again to Bob. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.